Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing a trade for the San Jose Sharks. In my trade deadline preview, I had discussed 3 players who could move for the Sharks, those being Sorensen, Marleau, and Dubnyk, and I had said, considering the Sharks had been winning as of late, we might only see Sorensen get on the move. But here today, the Sharks trade Devan Dubnyk to the Colorado Avalanche in exchange for a 5th-round pick this year and defenseman Greg Pateryn. So let's first talk about Greg Pateryn. First of all, it should be noted that the Sharks were paying around $2.1 million to Devan Dubnyk from the Minnesota Wild because the Wild retained 50% of his salary when the Sharks acquired him just a few months ago from that team. And Pateryn's making about $1.1 million, meaning the Sharks have saved about $1 million in terms of cap space, which could potentially come into play at some later point in these next coming days before the trade deadline does pass. It should also be noted that with Marc-Edouard Vlasic injured, the Sharks were playing a 6th defenseman in Christian Jaros, who has been okay, I guess, but not that great. And Greg Pateryn, as more of a veteran player in that role, could potentially come in as that 6th defenseman, and when Vlasic does get healthy, serve as a potential decent 7th defenseman. I guess we'll see how Pateryn actually looks in teal. On the other hand, this 5th-round pick is not necessarily fantastic, but it's nice to see the Sharks get something out of Devan Dubnyk, considering he was absolutely going to leave during this season's off-season. And if we actually compare to the trade that the Sharks made back with the Minnesota Wild a few months ago, the Sharks had traded a 5th-round pick in exchange for Dubnyk and a 7th. And so basically the Sharks' 5th-round picks even out because they traded away one, but they got one back. They ended up just with an extra 7th-rounder as well as Greg Pateryn for essentially flipping Devan Dubnyk over about a 6 or so month span, which I guess is pretty decent. You do also have to take into consideration that the 5th rounder that the Sharks are getting this year is from the Colorado Avalanche, meaning it's likely going to be a bottom 5 5th rounder in that 5th round compared to the 5th rounder that the Sharks traded in 2022, which, unless the Sharks really surprise next season, will probably at the very least be a mid-tier 5th round pick. So they're moving down in the 5th round when you consider that, but the 7th round pick and the potential usefulness of Greg Pateryn likely makes up for that. So a pretty decent trade for the Sharks thus far. What is most interesting, and the reason why I didn't know if the Sharks would actually try and move Dubnyk this season, is the fact that the Sharks still have multiple back-to-backs, and they do not have a veteran goaltender as a backup at this point. Martin Jones is seemingly going to start again here tonight, which is good because he's been very good against the Los Angeles Kings, but can be bad if Martin Jones ends up getting somewhat overworked down the stretch here. And coming into the backup role is either going to be one of Coronar or Melnichuk, and neither have any real NHL experience. Both of those players, I don't know if they even have any. I know Melnichuk has not played any NHL games. Coronar maybe has some preseason games under his belt, but realistically, neither of these players have played anywhere near the amount of games that Devan Dubnyk has. So in terms of backup goaltender, the Sharks have kind of flipped a coin in this one. It's possible it comes up heads and everything is good, and they're maybe even better than what Devan Dubnyk was given, considering he wasn't that great of a backup. Or the coin comes up tails and the Sharks end up costing themselves a couple of games for when the backups do inevitably have to start a game at some point this season. Class dismissed.